I wanted to get your reaction to this and your overall analysis. I definitely wanted to talk to you. You talk a lot about the empire and collapse. You can talk about the West's empire, but the United States really leads this empire. And we recently had news after days of this defense contact group meeting in Germany at an air base. And there was a lot of what seemed to be political theater. And then they finally Germany decided to send, I believe it's somewhere upwards of 100 Leopard 2 tanks. And the United States now is going to send its Abrams tanks somewhere in the range of 30 or so. And this has been a conversation for a while. How much to militarize Ukraine? How is this going to escalate? That's been the narrative. What's your reaction to this escalation by the United States? And where do you see this all fitting into the grand scheme of things globally, and how politics and the empire is kind of shaping out at this moment?
Well, the escalation is dangerous because what you're doing is constantly ratcheting up the lethality of these sophisticated weapons, industrial military weapons. So, if you go back to the beginning of the conflict, we were shipping small arms and ammunition, and then it exploded into this kind of orgy of war material: Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, Javelin anti-armor systems, along with other anti-armor systems, 155 howitzers. It's a large there. I was under those, shelled by those in Sarajevo, with over 1 million 155 millimeter artillery rounds, remote anti-armor mine systems. It's a very long list that has steadily increased the kind of weaponry that is in Ukrainian hands. And now, as you mentioned, we're talking about battle tanks, and Ukraine is already calling for F-15 and F-16 fighter jets, and Lockheed Martin, which makes them, has already said, although they say they haven't been asked, they're already preparing. So the more these weapon systems are used in the conflict against Russia, the more dangerous the situation becomes, and because, of course, Russia will also essentially escalate in this spiraling escalation. Nobody knows what happens in war. I covered war for 20 years. It controls you. You don't control it. Nobody knows where it's going to go. But certainly we are watching NATO edge closer and closer towards direct confrontation with Russia. I think the German foreign minister yesterday or something said we're at war with Russia. That's certainly how the Russians see it. And just one or two mistakes. The Russians bombing a convoy, for instance, of tanks crossing the border from Poland on Polish territory. Ukraine has already struck inside Russia, and then we have the specter of tactical nuclear weapons. The other thing about Ukraine, kind of like Gaza for the Israelis, is that it's a laboratory for weapon systems, and the weapons manufacturers and the Pentagon and everyone else is watching how these weapons perform. They're essentially being tested out on Ukrainians and Russians. So everybody has conceded, the head of NATO, and that this is a long war of attrition where we're not close to the end of this. So it's very dangerous. Things can easily go wrong. And we are provoking one of the globe's foremost nuclear powers. As Henry Kissinger, of all people, warned that we need to negotiate a settlement. Now they're talking about control of the eastern part of Ukraine and the Donbass, which is ethnically Russian and has been for 2 centuries. This is just nuts. Even the New York Times wrote an editorial talking about the folly of trying to take the Donbass and reincorporate it into the Ukraine. So it's very, very dangerous. And for those of us who spent a lot of time in war zones, watching this stuff is really, really chilling and really frightening.
Yes, indeed. And I wanted to ask you about then also, because you mentioned the Donbass, and this is where this conflict has mainly been fought, and it's really where it starts. And we had recently as well, prior to the agreement of the United States and Germany and a lot of these NATO countries to send this heavier equipment, there was an article in the New York Times, we covered it here, where it said Biden was warming up to taking or helping Ukraine take Crimea, because over the last, I mean, since this conflict began, since 2015, Ukraine's government has been talking about taking Crimea back from Russia after the referendum. And that narrative has only intensified as this conflict has gone on. What's your take on this question of Crimea and the Donbass, and maybe the context for this conflict? Because it seems like the more that this escalates, the more that the Western mainstream media apparatus takes our attention from the roots of how this all began. I'm not too surprised by that, but I'm wondering if you could help us understand what those roots are.
Right. Well, I was talking to George Galloway yesterday. He rented two venues to oppose uh, NATO involvement in the Ukraine war, and both of those venues canceled, wouldn't allow him to carry out his event. And I think that's because, as he said correctly, it's a position of weakness. They really don't want people to look too closely at how we got into this mess, and nor, I think, examine the fact that we have no idea of where we're going. It's like Afghanistan. Uh, what's the strategic goal? What's the goal? We're eventually going to have to negotiate, as Kissinger said again, although I loathe to quote him. There will have to be an exchange of land for peace. I mean, the goal is not, of course, victory in Ukraine. The goal is to degrade the Russian military, and hopefully, in the eyes of the architects of the NATO war machine, to remove Putin from power. Those are the two goals, and they will, if Ukraine has to be destroyed in the process, and hundreds of thousands of families devastated and destroyed, well, that's the price that they're willing to have the Ukrainians pay. Or, we have to be clear also, in Europe, the economic fallout from the war has been quite severe in countries like Germany. German industry, under the onslaught of inflation and the energy rise in energy prices and all that kind of stuff, they've really paid an economic price. That's why you see kind of fissures in NATO. They don't want this to go on too long, because they're suffering the consequences of the sanctions in a way that the United States is not. But I mean, how do we get into it? To even raise that historical truth is to be shut out. I was in Eastern Europe in 1989. I covered the revolutions in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. So I was present as a reporter when the promises were made by Hans-Dietrich Genscher, then the foreign minister in Germany, and Baker and others, that NATO would not be expanded beyond the borders of a unified Germany. Indeed, we all thought NATO at that point was now obsolete. Formed in 1949, was designed to prevent Soviet expansion into Eastern and Central Europe. Well, the Soviet Union no longer existed. And then we saw the kind of pimps for war who've been around for decades. Robert Kagan, I was dealing with Robert Kagan and Elliot Abrams when I covered the war in El Salvador. They were working in the State Department to discredit everything reporters on the ground were writing and reporting about the conflict. And I mean, in those days, the death squads were killing, the government death squads were killing between 700 and 1,000 people a month. And then wholesale army massacres, El Mozote, and everything else. So they've never gone away. They're wrong about everything. They were pushed for the expansion of NATO. They pushed for the wars in Iraq, in the Middle East. They were behind the calls to open the spigot. I think we've now given about $100 billion. The State Department budget is only $60 billion, $100 billion in aid and military equipment to Ukraine so far. It's no end in sight. but they never go away because they are funded by the war industry, the Atlantic Council, and they're all paid for by the war industry. And then, of course, the media gives them a platform and a perch. So to get up and speak about the antecedents, baiting Russia into this war, incorporating 14 countries in Eastern and Central Europe into NATO, which George Kennan, the great Soviet specialist, called the greatest blunder in post-Cold War diplomacy. We know where it's going. Now, because of WikiLeaks, we have memos written by William Burns, now head of the CIA, who said that Ukraine is a provocation across the political spectrum in Russia. It's a line that the United States and NATO shouldn't cross. Well, why? Why did they do it? I think two reasons. One, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we began to hear this rhetoric about a unipolar world, i.e., the United States is the sole superpower and can do whatever it wants. And of course, the Soviet Union or Russia was enfeebled, prostrate. It was unable to even feed its own citizens. And so they wrote Russia off. That was number one. Number two were the billions in arms sales that would be made by retrofitting countries in Eastern and Central Europe to make their militaries compatible with NATO equipment. Soviet and NATO equipment are not the same. They have different calibers. They can't use the same ammunition, etc. So I think those two reasons, and then we just broke promise after promise. I mean, the Clinton administration promised Moscow that it would not station NATO troops in these new NATO countries. I think now we have over 100,000. And it's tragic and unnecessary. I mean, I wrote a column a while ago, which is in my new book, The Greatest Evil is War, called Chronicle of a War Foretold, because we all knew what the response would be. Even Burns in the WikiLeaks, in the memo that was released by WikiLeaks, acknowledges what the response would be. And yet it was carried out anyway. And the tragedy, of course, is that Gorbachev wanted to build a security and economic alliance with Europe and the United States, as did Yeltsin, and people forget, as did Putin in the very early years of his regime. But if Russia wasn't going to be an enemy, then the militarists were going to make Russia the enemy, which they did. And then, of course, interfering in 2014 to overthrow a pro-Russian government. Then we turned Ukraine into a de facto NATO country. We trained over 100,000 Ukrainian troops. We precipitated this civil war in the Donbass that took, I can't remember the figure, about 14,000 lives. And here we are today. So this is a war that should have never been fought if the war industry had not been determining diplomacy. And that really is the tragedy. But even to get up and speak these historical truths is to be blanked out. And that's because I think they're nervous. I mean, the resources that are being pumped into Ukraine, the staggering sums of money, people are going to begin to ask questions. And so there's kind of iron control within the corporate dominated media of keeping critics such as myself essentially off the airwaves.
Mm. Yeah, and we're definitely going to get into that because there is a very concerted and coordinated campaign to keep people like yourself out of the information sphere as much as possible. But I wanted to ask before we get into that, because I think you talk about these historic truths. And so Russia has been since the beginning sounding the alarm about NATO expansion and made this a huge point of possible negotiations all the way back in December. I remember there was an attempt to have conversations with the US, with NATO, about NATO expansion and keeping Ukraine out of NATO. Now, throughout this time, and even prior to this, even back to the 2014 coup, when Russia started to get even more concerned after the coup in Ukraine, there's been this narrative that's gotten louder and louder in the Western mainstream media that NATO expansion is not a threat, that NATO is not a threat to Russia, and that NATO actually is not a threat at all. It's a defensive alliance. What do you have to say about that? Because I feel like there is this tendency to look at the Russia-Ukraine situation as isolated, and that's a tendency that I think is reinforced by the media. But it also, I think, is just something that is easy to do when there is so much attention on this conflict, not a lot of attention maybe on the contest. Could you talk about why Russia would find NATO to be a threat, given that they had this promise back in '89 with the United States that it would not expand? So what is the threat that NATO presents, if there is one at all?
Well, ask an Iraqi or an Afghan if NATO is a defensive military force. It has been now for over 2 decades an offensive military force in the Middle East and in Eastern and Central Europe. And I mean, frankly, NATO should have been abolished. NATO, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, became redundant. But the arms industry and the militarists were determined that they weren't going to go away. I mean, I was there. Everybody started talking about the peace dividend. We wouldn't have to divert staggering sums of state resources towards the military now that the Cold War was over. Well, that just shows you how naive we were. The budget, the military budget, was $853 billion or something that was just passed, is the second largest military budget since the end of World War II, I believe. And the militarists were not going to downsize. They weren't going to in any way accept a reduction in their profits, and they would sustain the permanent war economy any way they could. I mean, that's why they stayed in Afghanistan. We know from the Afghan papers that were published in the Washington Post that the military and political leadership years ago realized this was an unwinnable war, very similar in many ways to the Pentagon Papers, but they kept it going. Well, why? Because it's a very good business. And there were laments at the end of the Afghan war, which we lost, leaving in a humiliating defeat. There were laments by the war industry. But with the inception of the war in Ukraine, we've seen profits rise about 35% for Raytheon, Boeing, all these war weapons producers. Meanwhile, everybody else in the stock market's going downward. So yeah, and there's heavy pressure. Their lobbyists control both parties. The Democratic Party, in fact, there's more opposition to funding the war machine in Ukraine within the Republican Party now than there is within the Democratic Party. But in this budget, they gave the Pentagon $45 billion more than the Biden administration even requested. Is insanity. But that's how, excuse me, that's how late empires die, as Arnold Toynbee and others have written. It's this rampant, unchecked militarism that hollows the country out from the inside. That's how it killed the Roman Republic, which was a republic only in name by the end, much as we are, a democracy only in name. And you can't go again. If you are a political figure and you attempt to stand up to the war industry, you're destroyed, which is what happened to Dennis Kucinich. Democratic Party redistricted his district in Ohio so that he was out of a seat. And he ran for the mayor of Cleveland, was ahead of the polls. And then in the last 3 weeks, we don't know how much because it's all secret, but certainly millions upon millions in dark money was pumped into that race to destroy him. So, and Dennis had voted against the military budgets consistently for, I don't know how many terms he was in the House, about 8 terms or something. Well, of course, he was destroyed. Bernie understands this political lesson, which is why he won't take on the war machine. It's why AOC and the Squad and everyone else votes for funding for Ukraine. I will say AOC in the last vote, it was a no vote against the 1.7 trillion budget, which included the Pentagon. But yeah, they won't stand up against the war machine, given their political and economic power is to have no political future, and no one will do it. And so there's no accountability. The numbers in terms of taxpayer dollars just keeps going up and up and up with it doesn't even make any sense anymore. And so, yeah, they're playing around in Ukraine without any clear idea of where it's going to end up. But this isn't Afghanistan. This isn't Iraq. The consequences, especially if they start using tactical nuclear weapons, could be catastrophic.